We started off this review series with critiquing the plot, analyzing all the plot devices present inside the film, and how the plot itself makes the first installment, The Fellowship of the Ring, the best film out of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Now, let's look at how this film had to re-establish the fantasy genre and how it changed the medium forever. Hi, I'm Ohms, and welcome to OmzLaw. If you're new to the series, make sure to pause this video and watch the other 5 parts before continuing this one. I've left the links in the description, but this is also a standalone video anyways, so if you want to continue from here, that's fine as well. Before Fellowship of the Ring, fantasy was interesting to say the least. It wasn't like the genre wasn't there. The history of modern fantasy in literature, at least, is usually said to begin with George MacDonald, the Scottish author of novels such as The Princess and the Goblin and Phantastes, written in 1858, the latter of which is widely considered to be the first fantasy novel ever written for adults. MacDonald was a major influence on J.R.R. Tolkien, who also elevated the fantasy genre by providing one of the most detailed worlds ever to be conceived on paper. Middle-earth is so vast in terms of world building that it's quite shocking to believe that Tolkien could even conceive this. Down to the very languages, each letter of every race, every vowel, the sentence structures, the grammar and the rules, this world was real in his mind, and it almost mirrors our world with its richness and extraordinary detail. This could be a pretentious statement, but I sincerely believe that no one can compete with Tolkien's level of detail, not even George Martin, who still has to complete his own world and is starting to seem that he's given up on it entirely. In a sense, he tried to compete or honor Tolkien without really considering how much effort and time it took him to conceptualize Middle-earth, or without really understanding the methodology that Tolkien used. Yeah, I know, these are huge assumptions from my part, but when you look at some of his interviews, he tends to undermine Tolkien's world by stating stuff like, "And Aragorn ruled wisely and well for 100 years or something." It's easy to write that sentence, but I want to know what was his tax policy, and what did he do when famine struck the land, and what did he do with all those orcs? A lot of orcs left over. They weren't all killed, they ran away into the mountains. Sauron fell down, but you see all the orcs running away. Did Aragorn carry out a policy of systematic orc genocide? Did he send his knights out into the hills to kill all the orcs? These kinds of statements give off the impression that Tolkien doesn't think about consequences or doesn't elaborate on his plot devices or world building. However, Tolkien did explore another story that was never published about Middle-earth, taking place 105 years after the events of the Return of the King. And some of the ideas discussed there actually touch upon what George is referring to, which are the consequences of Aragorn becoming king and the ring being destroyed. But Tolkien backed off from this project as it no longer had that fantastical world of magic tied to it, since magic was already fading away at the time of the events of Lord of the Rings. Now, this isn't to say that George doesn't admire him or respect him, but that he sometimes says things to promote his own work which aren't true about Middle-earth or Tolkien. And that's kind of shocking coming from a guy who claims to have read Tolkien's work multiple times. So where am I going with this? Tolkien designed his world to be detailed, but not to the extent whereby it does not benefit the story. Aragorn as a character is designed to be a healer, a savior. He comes from this ancient race that is destined to save the world. He has royal blood. Sure, it's an outdated technique of solving the plot points of the story. You know, the good king wins the battle, is crowned, and rules a fair kingdom. But I really think George misses the point here with his statements, as Lord of the Rings isn't really about Aragorn becoming king. Sure, it's about the destruction of Sauron and the ring, but deep down, it's about Frodo and Sam and Gollum and how the ring, along with the events of the trilogy, affect them physically and psychologically. Tolkien was a survivor of war, and Frodo's journey to the Undying Lands, essentially his death, is symbolic to Tolkien's journey after the war, whereby he elaborates on PTSD and the pain he went through after everything was said and done. In the books, I know we said we wouldn't talk about the books, but it's important here in order to understand Tolkien's point of view. Frodo and the gang returned from their long quest to a destroyed Shire being taken over by Saruman. They then have to fight him off before they can truly begin rebuilding their home. Frodo spends his remaining days not fully healed, a broken man yearning for relief and absolution. This is why George's statements don't makes sense, as Tolkien cared a lot about consequences that mattered, consequences that fed into the overall narrative. Maybe George should take note here, as that may help him finish off his series, which is a decade overdue and has directly affected the artistic and creative decisions of a multi-million-dollar series, causing it to flop and angering fans all over the world. This is also why Lord of the Rings does not end when Frodo casts the ring into Mount Doom. Walsh and Philippa Boyens, along with Peter Jackson, made the strange choice to keep the events going, to the point whereby some audience members, while I was watching, walked out of the theater unable to finish the film. I, on the other hand, didn't mind it at all. In terms of filmmaking, the plot of Return of the King should have ended almost immediately after Frodo and Sam got saved. It could have even ended with them trapped on the mountain, leaving the rest of the story up for debate, but again, that's not what Lord of the Rings is about. And the writers knew this. They knew that it was about Frodo's journey and what war does to you, and how it breaks you mentally and physically, not just during the events, but after, and for years, and in some cases forever. And this leads us back to the point of the video. The filmmakers had to honor Tolkien in every way, and that task was the most difficult to accomplish with the first film, as they had so little to inspire from in terms of reimagining the fantasy genre. If you look at the films predating Lord of the Rings, you can get a pretty good idea of what I'm talking about. It's not like they didn't take themselves seriously, but let's just say they lacked that cinematic feel, like Matrix, Titanic, you know, that big blockbuster epic, that high budget, high production value. That's what Fellowship was up against, and boy did they deliver. The Fellowship had to reimagine the mise-en-scene of the fantasy genre. For those of you who aren't familiar with the term, it's basically French for placing on stage, and is defined as the stage design and arrangement of actors in scenes for a theater or film production, both in visual arts through storyboarding, visual theme, and cinematography, and in narrative storytelling through direction. Mise-en-scene is anything from colors, mood, atmosphere, to the choice of talent on screen. All these parts come together to complete a whole, and this is what Fellowship had to recreate. First off, the set had to be extremely detailed, downright ridiculous at some points. So did the costumes, and the hair and the props. Even the prosthetics needed to be realistic and believable. Sure, these elements are somewhat easy to pull off in relation to the visual and special effects present on screen. A lot of people confuse the two terms, but basically special effects is everything done on set, such as fire, smoke, or forced perspective, while visual effects is usually CGI, matte compositions, or anything composed inside of a software on a computer. Titanic and Matrix had already improved their respective genres through their contributions in visual and special effects, but fantasy was still extremely risky. The general audience wasn't really interested in fantasy at the time, and honestly, it's completely understandable once you examine the content being produced. It wasn't really for everyone and hasn't really aged well either. So it was an uphill battle, to say the least. The miniatures had to be detailed and realistic. They were scrutinized and constantly revised. The trilogy itself took almost 6 years to make, so yeah, this wasn't a 3-month gig or anything like that. These people breathed and ate and slept with this project on their minds. Insane dedication that can only be seen through the appendix features that come with the DVD and Blu-ray collections. In terms of feature films, Lord of the Rings still stands as the most detailed execution of a universe ever depicted on film. By keeping the tone comedic, yet serious when it needs to be, the general audience was immediately captivated by the characters and events we see on screen. As discussed in the previous video, Fellowship is efficient in establishing the world in every scene. When we first meet Gandalf, we can instantly tell he's a wizard through his costume. Yet his attire doesn't appear too comedic. It's not out there or upstaging or over the top. The dialogue is humorous but not silly, quite the opposite. It's rich in subtext and allegory and meaning. The dialogue usually foreshadows later events, plot points, or character arcs and motivations, like when we saw with the cave scene between Frodo and Gandalf. The text is also rich in vocabulary, sometimes sounding poetic like Galadriel's opening scene. The medieval time period really plays a role here in how the characters speak and behave, their motivations and their wants and needs. All of these have fidelity and belong to the time period that Tolkien and the filmmakers are portraying on screen. We also touched upon the interplay between light and dark and how that sets the tone for the entire story. Fellowship is excellent in communicating that. In fact, it does that in almost every sequence in the entire film, while the other two films don't really rely on this too often, as so many things come into play once the Fellowship splits up. The atmosphere, color grading, and mood presented in Fellowship borderlines a historical film intermixed with really well done CGI and magic. This film was the first of its kind to present this style, risked millions of dollars betting on it. And not only did it work, it set the stage for every fantasy film after it. I think the major studios realized after this that fantasy can be taken seriously, and that audiences worldwide would be willing to spend good money on epics like Lord of the Rings. Not only did it receive 13 nominations at the Academy Awards, it won 4 of them. That event is a joke anyways, but it's interesting to see the type of recognition it got. Sure, Return of the King won more, but it had 2 films predating it that set the stage for a lot of its success. Looking at the cinematography, the locations, the attention to detail, it's no wonder that audiences were so impressed. I know I was. I had never seen anything like it. The Balrog, Gandalf, Mordor, Rivendell, the Eye, this place was out of this world. You couldn't really tell if it was on Earth or on a different planet. It had mystery and suspense, gorgeous sets and costumes. Everything felt so real and alive. You could reach out through the screen and take out any prop or enter the gorgeous realm of the dwarf city. Even while watching these films with a friend almost a year back, and once more for this review, I just can't get over them, especially the Fellowship. I could spend an entire lecture talking about the details of a single scene inside of this film. Ever since I was a kid, I wanted my films to aspire from Lord of the Rings, to learn from their mistakes and shortcomings, from their successes and breakthroughs, and to leave that kind of impression on anyone is something I aspire to on a daily basis. That's what Fellowship of the Ring is, and that's why it's the best film out there. And I think any film that manages to do that for you, to make you feel that way, is a great film too. We've finally gone through the entire first film, but of course we still have 2 films to go. I'm thinking we change up the format of this series by not critiquing the plot in detail, but if you guys are still interested in that, then please let me know in the comments below. Like and share this video if you enjoyed it, and as always, a sub for the channel will really help me grow it. And I'll see you guys next time with more Lord of the Rings content. And as always, thank you for watching.